The wind had picked up as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the valley. I stood by the window, staring out at the mist that slowly crept across the field, swallowing the fence line and hiding the distant pines. It wasn't the first time fog had rolled into our valley. Living in the rural outskirts of Portville meant mornings heavy with dew and evenings cloaked in mist. But this fog, something about it felt different. It was thick, unnaturally so, and had arrived too early, long before the coolness of the night could bring it down from the hills. I closed the window and pulled my cardigan tighter around me, shivering despite the warmth inside. The house had grown cold after David's death, as if his absence had stolen something essential from it. He had always kept the hearth burning, and his voice used to fill these empty rooms. But now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the hum of the wind outside or the groan of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet. I moved to the fireplace, where the embers were dying, and poked them absently. For the past few months, I had convinced myself I was adjusting to life without David. I filled the days with chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied, but the nights were unbearable. In the dark hours, memories of him came flooding back with a painful intensity, making sleep an elusive thing. I had begun to dread the twilight, where his absence felt most profound. Tonight felt worse. There was a heaviness to the air, like something was pressing down on the farmhouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. The isolation of this place used to be a comfort, a retreat from the bustle of the town, but now it felt oppressive, suffocating. I glanced back at the window, where the fog had grown thicker, crawling toward the house like a living thing. I turned away, telling myself that I was being foolish. Fog was just fog. It didn't care about the grieving widow hiding away in the old farmhouse. But then I heard it, faint at first, barely audible above the crackle of the dying fire. My name, Margaret. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice came from outside, distant but unmistakable. My heart raced as I hurried back to the window, peering out into the darkening mist. At first, I saw nothing but swirling fog, but then a shadow moved at the edge of the field. A tall figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light from the house. It couldn't be. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure remained motionless, barely visible through the fog. And then the voice came again, clearer this time, the tone familiar enough to make my chest ache with hope and dread. Margaret. It was David's voice. It had to be. I knew every inflection, every note of it. But that was impossible. David was gone. Buried beneath the old oak tree by the church, his funeral held 6 months ago in the same biting cold air that seemed to accompany this fog. I stood frozen for a moment, torn between the urge to run outside and the gnawing fear that something wasn't right. My logical mind screamed that it couldn't be him, but the pull was undeniable. The fog pressed closer to the house, and the figure seemed to be waiting, watching. David? I whispered into the darkened glass, but the shadow didn't move. Silence fell over the field, thick and oppressive, until even the wind seemed to die down. I pulled myself away from the window, shaking my head. No, I wouldn't let grief twist me like this. David was gone, and no amount of fog or shadows would change that. But as I turned to go back to the hearth, one last whisper floated through the heavy air. Come to me, Margaret. I didn't look back. Instead, I pulled the curtains shut with trembling hands and threw another log on the fire, determined to keep the darkness, and whatever lurked within it, at bay. The fog was still there the next morning, thicker and heavier than before. It hung over the fields like a wet blanket, so dense that I couldn't even see the old barn at the edge of the property. It was as if the world beyond the house had vanished entirely, swallowed whole by the mist. I hadn't slept much after last night. The memory of David's voice calling to me from the fog haunted my every thought. As much as I tried to convince myself it had just been my mind playing tricks on me, the truth gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had crept into my world. I stepped outside, the damp air immediately clinging to my skin. The morning was unnervingly quiet, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, only the soft hiss of the fog as it moved lazily across the ground. I stood on the porch, staring out into the void, searching for any sign of movement. I didn't want to admit it, but I was hoping for that shadowy figure, for the familiar sound of David's voice again. I hated myself for it, but the pull was undeniable. Grief had a way of distorting reality, and I feared that it had already begun to twist mine. Margaret. There it was again. That voice. David's voice. I almost dropped the mug of coffee in my hand, my fingers suddenly numb from fear, or was it something else? The voice came from somewhere deep within the fog, the same haunting tone that had called to me the night before. I took a step forward without thinking, the worn wood of the porch creaking under my weight. My heart was pounding, a mixture of dread and desperate hope rising in my chest. But just as quickly, I stopped myself. What was I doing? David was gone. That was an immutable fact, and no amount of fog or whispers could change that reality. Whatever this was, it couldn't be him. But the voice kept calling, drawing me toward the fog's edge like a siren song. Margaret, please. The plea in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, awakening something deep inside me that I had buried since his death. I took another step forward, my feet almost moving on their own accord. The fog seemed to thicken as I approached it, swirling at the boundary of the porch, like it was waiting for me to step inside. There was a moment, a single heartbeat, where I considered crossing that threshold, leaving the safety of the house behind to follow the voice into the unknown. But then the shadow moved again. It wasn't like the figure I had seen the night before. No, this time it shifted unnaturally, slinking between the fog like a dark snake, twisting and writhing in the mist. It didn't seem human anymore. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but the pull was still there, urging me forward. Margaret. The voice again. But this time it was different, deeper, more distorted. It was David's voice, but it was wrong. Twisted somehow, like a poor imitation. I stumbled back, dropping the mug and hearing it shatter against the porch. The sound jolted me back to reality. What was I thinking? This wasn't David. It couldn't be. The figure in the fog shifted again, this time faster, darting out of sight, leaving only the suffocating silence in its wake. I stood frozen, watching the fog as if it might come alive and swallow me whole. My hands trembled as I backed into the house and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The weight of it all pressed down on me. What was happening? What had I almost done? I leaned against the door, my heart still racing. I didn't want to admit it, but something beyond my understanding was happening here. The fog wasn't just fog. And whatever was in it, whatever was mimicking David's voice, was watching me, waiting. The next afternoon, I was still rattled, my nerves frayed and on edge. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had become thicker, practically suffocating the farmhouse and its surroundings. I tried to busy myself with the normal routine, washing the dishes, folding the laundry, but I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should. I felt trapped, like the fog had seeped into the very walls of the house, and no amount of locked doors or closed curtains could keep it out. The doorbell startled me from my thoughts, and I nearly dropped the plate I was drying. My heart raced again as I approached the door, though I told myself it was probably nothing, just the mailman, maybe. But when I opened it, there stood Eleanor, her face etched with concern. Margaret, she asked, her brow furrowed. You all right? You don't look so good. Eleanor had always been a steadfast friend, even through the darkest moments after David's death. She was one of the few people in town who hadn't turned away from me, who hadn't grown uncomfortable with my grief and awkward silences. Her presence was a comfort, though I hadn't called her or told her what had been happening. Maybe she had sensed it. Or maybe the town had been talking. Small towns were like that. Word traveled fast. I forced a smile and stepped back to let her in. I'm fine, I said, but the lie sounded hollow, even to my own ears. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately darting to the windows. Still foggy out, huh? She moved closer to the window and peered outside, shaking her head. I haven't seen fog like this in years. It's like something straight out of a horror movie. I stiffened at her words, though she clearly hadn't meant anything by them. I walked to the kitchen, my hands still shaking slightly as I poured us both a cup of tea. Eleanor joined me at the table, her concern evident. "Margaret, you don't have to pretend with me. What's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days." I sat down across from her, the warmth of the teacup in my hands doing little to steady me. I could feel Eleanor's eyes on me, waiting for me to speak. I knew I couldn't lie to her, but I also didn't know how to explain what I had seen, what I had heard. How could I tell her that I had heard David's voice calling to me from the fog? That I had seen a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the reach of the house? "It's nothing," I said quietly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "Just the fog. It's making everything feel off, you know? I keep thinking I'm hearing things, seeing things that aren't there." Eleanor nodded sympathetically, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She reached out and took my hand, her touch grounding me. "It's all right, Margaret. You've been through a lot. It's only natural that things feel strange sometimes. But you know you're not alone in this, right? I'm just a phone call away." I smiled weakly and nodded, though her words did little to ease the growing tension inside me. She meant well, she always had, but there was no way to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. And the truth was, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. As we sat in silence, a low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the room. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was faint, coming from outside, just barely audible over the soft ticking of the clock. But I knew that sound. I had heard it before, in the fog. Eleanor looked up at me, her face clouded with confusion. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, my mouth dry. "It's just the wind," I lied quickly, standing up and moving toward the window. But when I glanced outside, the fog was thicker than ever, swirling and undulating as if alive. Eleanor stood up too, following my gaze. "Maybe I should stay with you for a bit," she said gently. "Just until the fog clears." I wanted to agree. I wanted nothing more than for Eleanor to stay. But deep down, I feared that whatever was out there in the fog, it would come back. And I didn't want Eleanor anywhere near it when it did. "No," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. You should get back before it gets worse." She hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded. "All right, but promise me you'll call if you need anything. Anything at all." I watched her leave, her figure disappearing into the fog until she was nothing more than a faint silhouette. As the door closed behind her, the house felt emptier than ever. The fog pressed against the windows, and for the first time in a long while, I wished I weren't alone. That night, the fog seemed to push even closer to the house, as if it was a living thing, testing the edges of my sanctuary. Every sound seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the trees outside. I had tried to settle down with a book after Eleanor left, but every few moments my mind would wander back to the voice, to the shadows lurking in the mist. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me with an almost physical force. I found myself pacing, unable to relax, my nerves as taut as wire. Every now and then, I glanced out the window, expecting to see the shadowy figure again. My heart leaped with every flicker of movement, whether it was a branch swaying in the breeze or the play of light and shadow from the dim lamps. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something or someone returned. Just after midnight, I heard the sound. It started faintly, a distant hum that grew louder with every passing second. I felt it before I heard it clearly, an unnatural vibration, like the sound of a beehive buzzing somewhere far off, but growing closer, insistent. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. It was coming from outside, carried by the fog like some ghostly chant. Slowly, with every muscle in my body tense, I made my way to the window and drew back the curtain. My breath caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the yard, was the figure again. This time, it was closer, standing just beyond the porch, barely visible through the swirling fog. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as I leaned closer to the window. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. It was tall, too tall to be human, and the way it stood unnerved me. There was something deeply wrong about its silhouette, something distorted. My hands began to shake, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "David?" I whispered, though even as the word left my lips, I knew it wasn't him. The figure took a step forward, and my stomach lurched with fear. I could see it more clearly now, the edges of its form shifting like smoke, blurring in and out of focus as though it wasn't fully solid. A face started to emerge, but it was twisted, misshapen, as though someone had tried to pull David's features from memory and failed. The eyes were wrong, hollow and dark, staring right at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back from the window, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't David. It wasn't even human. But it knew me. And it wanted something. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards now. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the noise seemed to be coming from inside my head. I doubled over, gasping for breath, as the hum transformed into a low, mocking whisper. "Come to me, Margaret." It was using his voice again, but this time, the distortion was unmistakable. The tone was off, an unnatural blend of David's voice and something else, something dark and ancient. I clamped my hands over my ears and backed away from the window, stumbling toward the hallway where the air felt less oppressive. As I turned, I spotted something I hadn't noticed before. There, sitting half-hidden under a pile of papers on David's old desk, was a leather-bound journal. It looked worn, its pages yellowed with age. I hadn't touched anything in David's study since he passed, but something about the journal called to me, pulling me toward it. With trembling hands, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The writing was in David's hand, but the contents made my heart race even faster. Sketches of strange symbols, notes on old rituals, and accounts of what could only be described as occult practices filled the pages. David had been involved in something far darker than I had ever imagined. The final entries were the worst. They spoke of a summoning, of a ritual meant to bridge the gap between worlds. But something had gone wrong. The last words, written in a hurried scrawl, sent a chill through my bones. "It's here. I can't stop it. God forgive me." My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, clutching the journal to my chest. The hum outside seemed to grow fainter, but I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. David had brought something into our lives, something unnatural and dangerous. And now it was here for me. The journal weighed heavily in my hands as I sat there on the floor, trying to process what I had just read. My mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. David had been dabbling in something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The fog, the voice, the figure outside, they were all connected to whatever ritual he had performed. And now I was left to deal with the consequences. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I needed answers, and as much as the thought terrified me, I knew the only way to find them was to confront whatever was lurking out there in the fog. I grabbed David's hunting knife from the kitchen drawer and a lantern from the hallway closet. The blade felt solid in my hand, offering a small comfort, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do against something not entirely of this world. Still, I needed to be prepared. If I was going to face this thing, I wouldn't do it unarmed. With the knife in one hand and the lantern in the other, I stepped outside into the dense fog. The cold, damp air clung to my skin as I moved cautiously down the porch steps and onto the grass. The mist swirled around me, so thick that I could barely see a few feet ahead. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through water, the ground beneath me soft and slick from the moisture. "David?" I called out hesitantly, though I knew deep down that it wasn't really him I was addressing. "What do you want?" The only response was the eerie silence of the fog. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking, to move deeper into the mist. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to run inside and lock the doors, but I couldn't. I had to know what this thing was, what it wanted from me. As I ventured further from the house, the fog grew denser, wrapping around me like a living thing. The air was so thick with moisture that it was hard to breathe, each inhale a struggle. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white, and tried to keep my mind focused. Every shadow that flitted through the fog felt like eyes watching me, tracking my every move. Then, from somewhere deep within the mist, I heard the voice again. Margaret. It was closer now, no longer the faint whisper I had heard from the safety of the house. This time, it felt as if the voice was right beside me, drifting just beyond the edge of the lantern's light. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, trying to locate the source. But the fog was disorienting, playing tricks on my senses. Margaret, come closer. I swallowed hard and took another step forward. The voice was leading me deeper into the forest, away from the familiar confines of the house. The ground beneath me became uneven, the tall grass giving way to rocks and fallen branches. I could just make out the outline of the old trees that surrounded the property, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands through the mist. Show yourself, I shouted, my voice trembling with both fear and anger. Stop hiding. For a moment, the fog parted just slightly, and I caught a glimpse of someone moving ahead of me. It was the same figure I had seen from the house, but now it was clearer, more defined. It moved like a shadow, gliding between the trees with an unnatural grace. And yet, there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the deepest parts of my grief. I stumbled forward, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the fog. The figure stopped moving, and for the briefest of moments, I saw it clearly. It was David, or at least something that looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but it was him. I knew it in my bones. David? I whispered, my voice cracking. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure shifted again, the familiar features twisting into something grotesque. The eyes that had once looked at me with love were now dark and empty, hollow pits that seemed to consume the light. The mouth stretched into a twisted grin, far too wide to be human, and a cold, mocking laugh echoed through the trees. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I clutched the knife tighter. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't David. It was a perversion, a mockery of the man I had loved. The fog swirled around me, and I could feel it closing in, pressing against my skin, cold and damp. I was surrounded by the mist, by the dark figure, by the overwhelming weight of my grief. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. I had crossed a threshold, stepped too far into the fog to return unscathed. The voice echoed one last time, sending a shiver down my spine. Come closer, Margaret. But I didn't move. I stood there, knife in hand, trembling but resolute. Whatever this entity was, it had drawn me into its game, but I wasn't going to play by its rules anymore. It wanted me to come closer, to give in to the fog and the darkness it carried. But I wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. The fog swirled around me, growing thicker, almost sentient in its movement. I stood frozen, the lantern's dim light barely cutting through the mist, my hand trembling around the knife. The twisted figure that had once resembled David moved closer, its form shifting and distorting as it glided effortlessly through the fog. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing before me was no longer human, if it ever had been. The last remnants of David's face melted away, replaced by a grotesque mask of darkness. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were deep black voids that seemed to absorb all the light around them. The twisted grin stretched impossibly wide across what had once been its face, teeth sharp and glistening in the faint glow of the lantern. For a moment, it simply hovered there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into its empty eyes. I could feel it studying me, searching me, probing my thoughts and emotions like it was feeding off my fear. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of my face. Margaret, the voice whispered again, but this time, the distortion was unmistakable. It was mocking me, toying with me. The way it said my name sent a chill down my spine, like nails on a chalkboard. I took a shaky step back, my eyes never leaving the creature. My mind screamed for me to run, to get away from this nightmare, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I tried to force myself to move, but the fog seemed to thicken around my legs, holding me in place. What do you want? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The thing didn't respond immediately, but its grin widened, and I could hear a low, guttural sound that resembled laughter. It was enjoying this, my terror, my confusion. It took another step forward, its form shifting with each movement, like it was struggling to maintain some semblance of shape. The fog wrapped around it like a shroud, twisting and writhing, and for a moment, I thought I saw glimpses of other faces within the mist. Faces of people I didn't know, distorted and broken, like they had been swallowed whole by the fog. "David is gone," the creature finally said, its voice a mix of growls and whispers. "But I remain. I am what he summoned." My stomach twisted at the words. The journal had warned of a failed ritual, but David had never mentioned what he had been trying to summon or why. And now, whatever he had called forth was standing right in front of me, an abomination that had taken on the twisted remnants of his face to lure me deeper into its grasp. I shook my head, stepping back again, my grip on the knife tightening. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You can't have me. You won't." The thing tilted its head, almost curiously, as if it hadn't expected me to resist. The fog swirled faster now, pressing in around me like a living force. I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin, but I fought the urge to scream. Whatever this thing was, it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every moment of my hesitation. It lunged forward, faster than I could react, closing the distance between us in an instant. I gasped and stumbled back, raising the knife defensively. The blade caught the edge of its form, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it laughed, a low, menacing sound that reverberated through the fog. "Your grief," it whispered, its voice crawling into my ears, "is what brought me here. Your longing, your sorrow. I feed on it, Margaret. And you have so much to give." I shook my head, trying to block out its voice, but it was inside my mind now, weaving its way through my thoughts. The images of David, his smile, his laugh, his touch, they flickered before my eyes, mingling with the creature's mocking voice. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as the memories came flooding back. But I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't give in to the fog. With a surge of desperation, I swung the knife again, this time slicing through the thick mist that wrapped around the creature's form. It hissed, retreating slightly, but I could see that my efforts were futile. This thing wasn't bound by the physical world, it was something else entirely. Something ancient, something that thrived on the emotions of the living. I knew then that this wasn't a battle I could win with weapons. The only way to defeat it was to deny it what it wanted most, my grief, my sorrow. But how? How could I let go of the pain that had consumed me for so long? How could I release the memories of David without losing the last pieces of him that I had left? The creature paused, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. It could sense my hesitation, my fear. And it was waiting for me to falter, for me to give in. But I wouldn't. Not yet. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of the creature's presence pressed down on me. The knife in my hand felt useless, a flimsy defense against something that wasn't bound by flesh and bone. The fog swirled closer, thickening around me until I could barely see beyond the faint glow of the lantern. It was closing in, suffocating me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the creature's dark, hollow eyes watching, waiting for me to break. But I wouldn't, at least, not yet. I had something it didn't know I had. A last piece of David's life, buried deep within the journal's pages. A ritual. A way to end this. I wasn't sure it would work. David hadn't exactly left instructions on how to fix what he had summoned, but it was all I had. Clutching the knife tighter in my hand, I forced myself to move. I turned and ran, stumbling through the fog toward the house. The creature's laughter echoed behind me, low and guttural, as if it knew that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't truly escape it. But I pressed on, forcing myself through the thick mist, each step feeling like a monumental effort. The fog tugged at me, cold and wet, but I pushed through, heart pounding, breath ragged. Finally, the farmhouse came into view, a faint outline against the suffocating mist. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it, though I knew a locked door wouldn't keep the thing out. It had already come too far into my life for something as simple as wood and bolts to stop it. I didn't have much time. The fog pressed against the windows, the distorted laughter of the creature vibrating through the walls. I could feel its presence creeping closer, a dark shadow that seeped into every corner of my mind. I dropped the knife on the table and grabbed the journal, flipping through its pages until I found the section I had been looking for, the ritual David had attempted, the one that had gone so horribly wrong. My hands shook as I read the words, trying to piece together what needed to be done. Symbols. Incantations. But there was something else, something I hadn't seen before. A sacrifice. It needed a sacrifice to work. I swallowed hard as my eyes scanned the final lines of the page. To banish the entity, I had to give up what tied it to me. My connection to David. The grief, the sorrow, the pain that had tethered me to him for so long. But it wasn't just emotions, it was something physical, something meaningful, something that had been a part of him. My gaze fell on the small wooden box sitting on the mantel. Inside was the last gift David had given me before he died, a silver locket engraved with our initials. I hadn't taken it off for months after his death, clutching it like it was the last lifeline between us. Even now, after I had stopped wearing it daily, it remained the most precious thing I owned. I knew what I had to do. My heart ached as I crossed the room and opened the box, my fingers trembling as I lifted the locket from inside. The silver gleamed softly in the dim light, and for a moment, I was flooded with memories, our wedding day, the warmth of his hand in mine, the way he had laughed when he fastened it around my neck. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the locket to my chest. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to the life I had shared with David, to the love that had defined my world. But that connection was also what the creature had been feeding on, what it had used to crawl its way into my life. If I didn't break it, I would lose more than just the locket. I would lose myself. The walls groaned as the fog pressed harder against the house, the creature's voice now a chorus of low whispers and dark promises. It was close. Too close. I grabbed the knife and knelt by the fireplace, opening the journal to the page with the incantation. My voice shook as I began to speak the words, my hand trembling as I pressed the blade against the locket. The metal was cold under my fingers, but the weight of what I was about to do made it feel heavier than stone. The creature's laughter grew louder, the fog swirling violently outside the windows, but I pressed on, chanting the words from the journal. With a final cry, I drove the knife into the locket, shattering it in half. The silver split cleanly under the pressure, and the moment it broke, a gust of wind tore through the house, extinguishing the lantern's flame. For a moment, everything was silent. The fog stopped moving. The whispers ceased. I knelt there in the darkness, clutching the broken pieces of the locket, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt lighter, as though the oppressive force that had been crushing me for so long had finally lifted. But I knew it wasn't over yet. I knelt in the suffocating darkness, my hands trembling as I clutched the broken pieces of the locket. The oppressive weight that had filled the air moments before was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost foreign. The silence was so complete that it rang in my ears, disorienting me after the ceaseless hum and whispers of the creature that had haunted me. I wanted to believe that it was over, that the ritual had worked, that the entity had been banished. But the cold knot of fear in my stomach wouldn't let me relax just yet. Slowly, I rose to my feet, feeling the ache in my knees and the heaviness of my breath. The air in the house felt different, lighter somehow, like the weight of the fog had lifted, though I couldn't see beyond the darkened windows to confirm it. I took a cautious step toward the front door, feeling every inch of the space around me with heightened awareness. I could still sense the remnants of the entity, like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire. Gripping the broken locket in one hand and the knife in the other, I took a deep breath and reached for the door. My heart pounded as I unlocked it and slowly pulled it open. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what I would find beyond the threshold. But then, the fresh, cool air hit my face, and I gasped with relief. The fog was gone. The thick, suffocating mist that had swallowed the valley whole was no longer there, replaced by the pale light of the moon shining down on the damp earth. The trees stood tall and clear in the distance, no longer obscured by the heavy veil that had shrouded them for so long. I stepped outside, still clutching the knife, though now it felt more like a security blanket than a weapon. The grass was wet beneath my feet, and the air smelled clean, like rain had just passed. I couldn't hear the creature's whispers anymore, and the ever-present hum that had followed me for days was finally gone. It was over. I wanted to cry in relief, to collapse right there in the yard and let all of the emotions I had been holding in pour out. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I walked around the house, scanning the yard and the edges of the forest for any sign of the creature. The moonlight illuminated everything clearly now, casting long shadows, but revealing no figures lurking within them. The fog had truly lifted, and with it, the dark presence that had haunted me. The empty void where the fog once swirled was both a comfort and a reminder of the battle I had just survived. My thoughts flickered back to the journal, to the warnings David had written in his frantic scrawl. I wondered if he had felt the same sense of relief after the ritual he had tried to perform, only to have the fog return and swallow him whole. I let out a long, shaky breath and walked back toward the porch. My legs felt weak beneath me, and the weight of everything that had happened settled onto my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I couldn't stop the tears from spilling down my cheeks as I clutched the broken locket in my hands. I sat down on the steps of the porch, staring out at the moonlit landscape in front of me. The world felt different now, lighter, as though some dark cloud had finally been lifted. And yet, I knew there was still a part of me that felt the absence of the fog as a loss, like I had finally, truly let go of David. I stared down at the broken pieces of the locket. It had been the last physical tie I had to him, the last thing that connected me to the life we had shared. Destroying it had been the hardest thing I had ever done, but I knew it was necessary. I had let my grief control me for too long, had allowed it to pull me deeper into the darkness. I had fought against it for months, refusing to let go of the pain because it was the only thing I had left of him. But now, as I sat there in the moonlight, I realized that letting go didn't mean forgetting him. It didn't mean erasing the love we had shared or pretending that he had never existed. It meant freeing myself from the weight of the past, from the fog that had clung to me for so long. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool breeze against my face, and allowed myself a moment of peace. The fog had lifted, and with it, the entity that had haunted me. But more than that, the fog inside me had lifted too. I could breathe again. I could live again. And though I knew the memories of David would always be with me, I also knew that I didn't need to hold on to the pain anymore. I could let go. I could move forward. As I stood up and made my way back inside the house, I paused one last time on the porch, gazing out at the quiet night. The world felt different now, and so did I. The fog had lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had been given a second chance at life. But even as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more out there in the darkness, something else lurking just beyond the edges of the forest, waiting for the right moment to return. For now, though, the night was still, and I would take that small victory. The days that followed were eerily quiet. The fog never returned, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely again. The house, once filled with oppressive silence and dark memories, now felt lighter, almost peaceful. I spent my mornings walking through the valley, marveling at the clarity of the world around me. The trees, the fields, the distant mountains, they all seemed sharper, as though the veil that had once dulled everything had been lifted. But while the fog was gone, the memory of those nights remained. I found myself haunted not by the entity, but by the choices I had made. The ritual had worked. I had banished the creature, severing its connection to me by destroying the last link I had to David. But even as I had shattered the locket, I had felt a part of myself break with it. Letting go of the pain had brought me freedom, but it had also left me with an emptiness that was difficult to explain. Eleanor came by more frequently after that. I hadn't told her the full story. How could I? I wasn't even sure I believed it all myself. But she knew something had changed, and she was careful not to press me too much. Instead, she kept me company, bringing groceries and tea, sitting with me by the fireplace as we talked about small things. She was a grounding presence in the aftermath of everything, a reminder that life, somehow, moved forward. One evening, as Eleanor and I sat in the living room, a small gust of wind blew through the open window, rustling the papers on David's old desk. I hadn't touched anything in that room since the night of the ritual. The journal still lay there, open to the page with the final incantation. Every time I looked at it, I felt a shiver of unease, as if the words held a power I couldn't quite understand. "You should burn it," Eleanor said one evening, noticing the way my eyes lingered on the journal. I nodded, but something inside me hesitated. The journal had caused so much pain, had brought something dark and dangerous into my life. But at the same time, it was all I had left of David. His handwriting filled the pages, his thoughts and fears etched into every line. Destroying it felt like destroying another piece of him, and I wasn't sure I could do that. But I also knew that leaving it untouched wasn't an option. There was a power in those pages, something that had reached beyond the veil of our world and summoned a force I could barely comprehend. I had to be certain it wouldn't return. That night, after Eleanor had left, I sat alone in the living room, the journal in my lap. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I opened the journal to the first page, tracing my fingers over David's careful script. The words were innocent enough at the beginning, notes on folklore, theories about the afterlife, musings on old rituals. But as the pages went on, the writing grew more frantic, more desperate. It was clear that David had been searching for something, a way to reach beyond death, to grasp at some form of immortality. And in doing so, he had opened a door that should have remained shut. My heart ached as I flipped through the pages, knowing that I would never fully understand why he had done it. But I also knew that I couldn't allow the past to control me anymore. With a deep breath, I stood and walked to the fireplace, holding the journal over the flames. The fire licked at the edges of the paper, and for a moment I hesitated. But then I let it go, watching as the pages curled and blackened, the ink dissolving into ash. The fire consumed the journal quickly, the flames bright and fierce for a few moments before dying down again. I felt a strange sense of relief as I watched the last remnants of David's obsession disappear into the hearth. It was over, truly over. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt like a blessing, not a curse. I sat back down in the armchair, staring into the dying embers of the fire, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The fog was gone. The creature was gone. And with it, the darkness that had clung to me for so long had finally dissipated. As I sat there in the quiet, I allowed myself to think of David, not the desperate, broken man who had delved too deep into the unknown, but the man I had loved, the man who had built a life with me in this house. I smiled softly, knowing that while the memories of him would always be with me, they no longer held the power to pull me into the darkness. But even as I let myself feel that peace, I couldn't ignore the slight unease that still lingered in the back of my mind. The journal had been destroyed, the fog had lifted, but the woods beyond the valley remained, dark and untamed. And somewhere out there, I could still feel the faintest pulse of something ancient, something waiting. For now, though, the night was still, and I could rest in the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. Whatever came next, I would be ready.
If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.